the region. Over time, volunteers from across the globe flocked, aiming to join ISIS and follow teachings promulgated by its leaders, flocked to the MENA region. Since its inception, however, ISIS has become gradually weaker, and volunteers faced many disappointments and are deeply disillusioned. A unique problem is posed by the children had by volunteers over the years. With ISIS in decline, they have nowhere to go, and the states in which they reside are unable to take care of them. Today, we are joined by Dr. Azeem Ebrahim, director at the Newsline Institute in Washington, D.C., and a columnist at Foreign Policy magazine. He received his PhD from the University of Cambridge, after which he completed fellowships at the universities of Oxford, Harvard, and Yale. Dr. Ibrahim is the author of two seminal books. The first being The Rohingyas Inside Myanmar's Hidden Genocide, published in 2016, and the second being Radical Origins, or Why We Are Losing the War Against Islamic Extremism, published in 2017. Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon, and welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Ibrahim, assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Now, let's begin by talking about how thousands of these children, now known as the ISIS kids, so Daesh years ago attempted to create an Islamic state, but was met by many challenges, resulting in what can only be described as a failure. Upon its inception, Daesh recruited a multitude of volunteers from around the world, some of whom stayed in northern Syria and Iraq. Do you think that the volunteers stayed behind and did this even after seeing the structures? Why do you think that the volunteers stayed behind and did this even after seeing the structures that Daesh put into place begin to collapse?
Yeah, so the motivation of the volunteers is obviously something that I can't necessarily speak upon. Everybody had their different motivations in terms of why they traveled to Iraq and Syria in the first place to join Daesh, to join ISIS. However, I have to say my concern is not necessarily those individuals that are still languishing there, despite the fact that ISIS territory is now non-existent. My issue and my concern and my focus has been on the children of the ISIS detainees. And I think we have to be very careful here in terms of the terminology we use. I know lots of people use the term ISIS children. I think the much better term would be the children of ISIS detainees, because these children themselves are not ISIS in any shape or form. They are essentially victims here. Many of them were brought without their knowledge. Obviously, being children, they had no idea where the parents were taking them. Many of them, the majority of them, were actually born within ISIS territory and born in the camp. So they themselves are not party to any of the accusations made against individuals and their motivations. They are innocent children. There are over 17,500 of them, are the numbers that we know, languishing in camps in Syria and Iraq. I visited the camps in last year, around April, May. I went to the two big camps, Bulhole and the others, and where most of these children are actually being held, and the conditions in which they are held are extremely, extremely dire. Mm-hmm. And my argument is that the argument I'm trying to make is that all of these children should be repatriated back to their home countries as soon as possible. They are innocent parties in this. They have been in these camps for far too long. The conditions are not conducive for any child whatsoever. And failing to do so will not just be a humanitarian crisis, but it'll actually be a security issue, because you are essentially now creating the next generation of ISIS fighters. These children are being radicalized in those camps. And the best thing that we could do as a society, as a country, is to take these children out of these camps and bring them back to the home countries, where they can be properly looked after by extended family members, or in some cases even by social services. But being in the camps is certainly not conducive at all.
Okay, and then refugee camps in northern Syria house massive amounts of people. Some reports have approximated the number to be around 70,000, a majority of them women and children, and many of them under the age of 5 years old. What do you imagine their living conditions to be like, and how long do you imagine that they will be there?
Yeah, well, I don't need to imagine, because I've been there myself. I've seen it myself. The conditions are extremely, extremely poor and dire. They are not suitable for children at all. I know many of the women, there are lots of women in the camp, so the women and the men are completely separated. There's lots of women in these camps. And as I said, they are not my concern. Most of these women are guilty of atrocious crimes. And I firmly believe that they need to face the sharp end of justice to pay for the crimes that they have committed against the Iraqi and the Syrian people, particularly the Yazidis. Many of these women, even the ones that have travelled from the West, from Europe or South Africa or the United States or elsewhere, they were involved in trafficking of sex slaves for their husbands. And whilst their husbands were fighting on the front line, they were the ones that were principally managing the Yazidi slaves for the ISIS, for the Caliphate. And so they have to face justice, but they are not my concern at all. My concern, as I've indicated, is the children. And I think that those children are being treated in a very, very unjust fashion, and they should be repatriated with immediacy to the host countries. Now, the difficulty is that international law, does not allow children to be separated from their parents. But I think that in this situation, we have to explore innovative mechanisms by which to actually do this. I think many of the mothers would actually be quite willing to give up their children so that they can go back to the UK or go back to Canada or wherever, where they can have a much better life with their grandparents or with extended family members. And in cases in which they are not willing to give up their children, I believe that we should start exploring mechanisms by which they can be forcibly removed. And there's provisions in law. Every country has provisions in law in which a child can be removed from its family if they're victims of abuse. And I cannot imagine that there is a greater form of abuse than radicalizing your children in a refugee camp to turn them into extremists, the next generation of extremists. So I think these things have to be explored, and I think they have to take action to move the children out of the camps.
And then packed into camps, cramped, and practically living on top of each other, the risk of disease undoubtedly runs rampant. With the coronavirus pandemic getting increasingly worse and diseases like cholera and other waterborne diseases thriving in such environments, how do you think the children will manage to stay safe under conditions of squalor?
Well, this is a very good question because the conditions in the camps were already extremely dire. And now with the restrictions of coronavirus and COVID, they have deteriorated even further. Access to the camps is extremely restricted, is extremely limited. And there's even insufficient water, for basic sanitation, let alone washing your hands, multiple times a day, as is recommended by the WHO to tackle the virus. So because of access to the camps has been limited, we are unable to ascertain and determine, what the conditions precisely are within the camps. But as you can imagine, with the current winter onset, you must have seen the pictures on the news. Many of these people are just living in plastic and tarpaulin tents. And with the winter onset, the snow and the ice, this is no place for children to actually be. And, this is why they have to be removed from those camps with immediacy.
Okay, and then I know you've spoken to this a little, but could you delve into it a bit more? So under international law, it's been decreed that children are the responsibility of their home country, but it's clear that neither Syria nor Iraq have the best interests of these children at heart. What do you think will happen to them in time to come?
The Iraq and Syria both do not recognise these children. They do not want to give these children nationality because they are the children of many foreign fighters of ISIS. So they are not keen on giving them nationality and making them part of their own society. So they're essentially stateless. And many Western governments, including the United Kingdom, have stripped the parents of their nationalities, of their passports. So they are unable to return to the home country. So these children are essentially without identity. They are without state. And this is just a recipe for disaster. For the psyche of a child to be told that you do not belong anywhere, you do not have a home, you're of nowhere, then obviously that vacuum will be filled by the likes of the ISIS ideology to say, well, you still belong to us, you're still part of our family. And the eventuality, and many of them are actually waiting for this, that the ISIS make a return to territorial control, then that vacuum will be easily filled by recruits such as these children, many of whom are much older now. Many of them are now going into their teens, and this is the only thing they've ever known. is that we belong to ISIS. So this is a recipe for disaster, and immediate action has to be taken to rectify this.
Mhm. Since you've mentioned it, do you think that ISIS could return to territorial control?
I think anything is possible. We still have tens of thousands of the fighters um, uh, 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 under um, under arrest in ISIS territory. But look, the reality is that there's still an appetite for them to return. But ISIS has changed its modus operandi now. So before they used to measure their success by the amount of territory they controlled, unlike other militant organizations, other extremist organizations like Al Qaeda, they would measure their success by the amount of terrorist attacks that they undertook. ISIS actually wanted to control territory. Now they have adopted their methods. They are now also measuring their success by the amount of terrorist attacks they undertake, the amount of recruits that they have online, and the spread of the ideology, and even the column inches of media coverage that they receive in the West. So the measure of success has changed dramatically, but that does not necessarily mean that they will not revert to the old ways of trying to control territory.
Okay, and then you've touched on this a little bit, but over the course of the past few years, atrocities and crimes have been committed by the Islamic State against the Yazidi people in Iraq and other Syrian nationalities. Could you delve deeper into this and tell us a little about what exactly ISIS has been inflicting upon these people?
So ISIS is responsible officially for a genocide against the Yazidi people. Their ambition was to wipe out these people in their entirety. This is very well known and well recorded. When they took over the Sinjar region of the Yazidis, they murdered the majority of the males, and they took the females as sex slaves for the ISIS, for their own fighters. And so this was one of the great atrocities of the Syrian war that ISIS committed against these people. And this is why I reiterate my position that the adults that are being held, whether they are from the West, whether they are from anywhere else, whether they're male or female, are not my concern. My belief is that these people need to face justice. They cannot be repatriated to their countries. I know there is a movement by various people in the West to say, well, look, this is a British problem, a French problem, Canadian problem, or South African, and it is their country's problem to repatriate their citizens and put them on trial and imprison them. I completely disagree with that. I think that these people travel from all over the globe. They committed heinous crimes against the people of Iraq and the people of Syria. They must face justice in those countries. The victims of their crimes should have their day in court. And the best way to do this is to set up an international tribunal of the highest legal standards that's fully transparent, where no evidence is obtained through torture, where there is no death penalty, and those people are tried in the countries in which they committed their crimes. So the victims of their crimes, can look them in the eye and they can see justice is being done. And otherwise, it will simply be interpreted that they have come to our country, committed these crimes, they've gone back to their own countries, where they'll have nothing but a soft prison sentence, and then apparently they'll be rehabilitated and reintroduced into society. And this is after they've committed all these heinous crimes against their victims in Iraq and Syria.
Thank you so much for joining us today and for that very interesting conversation about Daesh and the ISIS kids.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Dr. Azeem Ebrahim, director at the Newslines Institute in Washington, D.C., and a columnist at Foreign Policy magazine, talking to us about how ISIS volunteers have, over the last few years, had children and how they are now facing dire conditions and extreme difficulty. And that brings us to the end of this afternoon's show. Remember that this segment can be found on our Facebook and Twitter pages. From myself, Humairaa Mayet, and the Azeem Salam Media, thank you for tuning in. This